All right, a couple more minutes and we'll get started. For those online, as I'm talking in the room here, I'm stepping away from the computer a bit. So if you need to ask a question, just jump in. All right, good afternoon, everybody. I posted this to Canvas. I posted an updated version last night. So if you haven't been on, if you were on there prior to that, you might want to look at the latest. It's a few more updates and some adjustments based on just current events. One of the interesting elements of international business, international marketing, the classes that I teach, is it never really changes. It's always being updated. We're in that living classroom, as I referred to. And what that essentially all that means is this textbook was printed a couple of years ago, and we talk about various topics, and I had one this morning, quite frankly, and as we look at world events between the time that the textbook was printed and what's going on now, we want to be up to date as much as possible. So I try to incorporate that into these updates that I put into the class sessions. So it's on Canvas in the files section. Also I record each session. So the video link, I post the video to YouTube and send out the link to you through announcements on Canvas. If you haven't seen those, refer to those. You at least can go back and review some of the things I say and keep me honest in that regard. So today, we'll talk about some of the national differences, and it's important for us in business as we navigate the different countries that we're going to do business in. It's important for us to be up to date as much as possible on what's the latest in political challenges or changes in a particular country. What's the latest in some of the legal systems or the economic and social systems? All of these that go into the assessment of and the decisions that we're going to make from that assessment, all right? And in addition to doing that as throughout our careers, I and mine and you as you graduate from here, also your project teams are designed such that you're going to look at these decisions, and the project you choose as a team will encompass some of this. And I can assure you, when it comes time for making your presentation, some of the questions I'll be looking at and asking you are, why did you make that decision? Why did you choose that particular country? This morning in my international marketing class, I talked about a country called Myanmar, okay? Southeast Asia, formerly called Burma. The textbook said Myanmar is open for business, which it has been. If anybody who followed of the last couple of months or even month, you'll see that the military just arrested the president, and right now Myanmar is probably not open for business. But those are the kind of events, and we'll talk about some of those as we get through today. We'll understand the political systems, the economic, legal systems. It's imperative for us to understand all of those. And not to minimize economic or political systems, but the legal systems are going to present us with some challenges. And I may, throughout the semester, challenge you in terms of the decisions you make. Are they ethical? Are they legal? All right, we're going to encounter that. The things that may be legal in one country may not be legal here. And we're bound by the laws of this country here if this is where we're from. All of this translates to how we navigate the global markets. How we manage the risks associated with the decisions we make to enter or exit or form a country or form a joint venture. Kenya, one of the few countries I've not been to, so I have not been to Kenya, but as we look at this from the standpoint of how we position it in its position in Africa and its position within the world, it really has been a model for us to look at in many respects on how we take a relatively undeveloped country, a relatively impoverished community, and turn it into an economic powerhouse, an area that companies can look at for growth and for sustained growth over time. It's got an agricultural history, but beginning to look and emerge in other areas as well, and even in manufacturing and in financial services. Gained its independence, as many countries we talk about gained their independence from Great Britain in 1960s, early 1960s, so relatively new nation, so to speak. As they gained their independence, they made some decisions. They made some decisions that they felt were relevant and appropriate for their country at the time. Now, as we're going to see, ultimately, they may have made some modifications to that original decision. But initially, they felt, as they emerged on their own and became independent from Great Britain, that they wanted a socialism type of structure. They had a very clear and decisive emphasis on their decisions would be based on their own African culture. They wanted to avoid any distinction of class. No upper class, no lower class, none of this other. They wanted to avoid that. And while that's a lofty goal, I think it's an important goal, especially in today's society. They also made a decision economically and in terms of how to plan their corporate climate, that they wanted to emphasize domestic production, even to the tune of erecting trade barriers in the form of high tariffs on anything coming into the country. As we're going to see today and throughout this semester, we are interconnected. Countries, cultures, communities, economies, we are dependent on each other. We are interconnected. Kenya has its origin in agriculture, sizable portion of it. They began to stagger in the 1990s, okay? Today, because of some of the changes in their decisions, they are now growing at a relatively good rate when compared to other country GDP. How did they go from those centrally planning decisions to a vibrant economy? How did they do this? They made some reforms. In the early 1990s, just less than 30 years after they were in their existence, they decided to let the market speak for itself. They removed price controls on the products and the services that were being transacted. They removed trade barriers between them and surrounding nations. Quite frankly, anybody that they were doing business with. They transitioned from state-owned enterprises to private enterprises, a significant portion to a significant step to opening up and creating a free market economy. They implemented fiscal and monetary policies that were designed to invigorate the economy and not stifle it. In essence, in all of that, they moved to a market-based economy. That's a fundamental decision, strategically and philosophically, and all of the associated infrastructure that's essential to do that. And that's how they've transitioned from a stagnant economy to one that's growing at 5 to 6% a year. Now, oftentimes, and you'll hear me say this, when we look at GDP year over year, we see this growth rate or not. For the time being, we're treating the year 2020 as an outlier. 2020 was a crazy year. A lot of countries, their GDP just did not grow at the pace that they had been doing historically. I don't know, anybody see that commercial in the Super Bowl? 2020 gives you lemons. Everybody's getting hit with lemons. It's kind of the way the economy was throughout the world. Kenya, 2019, nearly 5.5% growth rate year over year. Pretty good. Considering the United States didn't grow that fast. China did, India did, Kenya was in that percentage category. Now, transitioning to a free market economy sounds nice on paper, but how do you do that? How do we move from pure agriculture? Well, we need to improve the infrastructure in the technology arena. We need to increase investment and participation and enrollment in the universities, educate our workforce, our population. Reach out to different organizations, and we'll talk about them as we talk about International Monetary Fund and others who helped fund some of this investment. To create a free market economy, we have to have an infrastructure that enables it. We looked at job growth, advancements in technology, education, healthcare, improving the services from government to the people, as well as between companies, the services offered. All of this translates to improving and creating a vibrant economy. This is the essence of how a country like Kenya can transition from stagnation to growth. The decisions that they made at the senior levels of government and how they permeate throughout the commercial sectors. Took political reform. Not easy. And I can assure you, as I mentioned too earlier in one of my classes, when you have a new administration, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in India, I don't care where, when you have a new administration who implements new policies, guess what? There's resistance from some of those who were benefiting from the prior administration or the prior policies, right? It's critical. It takes political fortitude to really move through that. Created a new constitution. 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 2019, 20 when there are political differences, we have the rule of law and the constitutional guidance. It helps mitigate and mediate those disputes. When we in business can see the growth, the sustained growth, the policy changes, and quite frankly, policy changes that last from administration to administration to administration, we gain confidence that the stability of that country is someplace that we want to invest in. We're going to talk about that this semester in the context of what's called foreign direct investment, FDI. Remember that term, it's going to come up often. When we feel confident in a country like Kenya or India or wherever, we will feel better about investing and putting our limited resources into that particular location and building an operation. When we see a workforce, a population being educated, young, your age group, coming up and taking leadership and having opportunities ahead of you. When we see education at all levels permeating throughout society, we feel that it's sustainable. We have confidence that in the future it's going to still exist. And with any country changing and transitioning and growing, it's never completely perfect. Okay? Of course, there's challenges that still exist. Some of it in the context of the laws associated with land ownership. If you don't have true title to property, there's a lot of ambiguity in terms of who owns it and who benefits from it. Property rights is a critical element in terms of understanding the sustainability and strength of an economy. All right, that's Kenya. Let's talk about another country called Russia. Pretty significant country. Now, you weren't here, but I witnessed and was around and working in the business world in the 1989 timeframe when the Berlin Wall came down. The Soviet Union, as it was called, was no more. The vast network of countries and cultures and economies that the Soviet Union managed and controlled changed quickly. Not just in Russia, but in Germany. What was East, what was West. Countries like Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia as it was called then, others, now Estonia, now we're on their own. When that changes, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, sometimes those who benefited under the previous policy are certainly going to provide some resistance to it, or they may also still provide some not so legal decision-making going forward. As the Soviet Union changed to what we now call Russia only, much like Kenya, transitioning from a purely socialistic to somewhat market-based. Now, Russia has never truly transitioned to a free market, per se. But many of the state-owned enterprises, firms, companies became more privatized. Unfortunately, many of them were privatized to those who were very well connected in the Soviet Union government. So whether or not it was truly as clean as it looks on paper, certainly as it's open for discussion. Much like the rest of the world in 2008, 2009 timeframe, we went through an economic downturn. A country like Russia or Venezuela or Saudi Arabia or many others that have built their economy around oil and gas, they do very well when the price of oil is very high. They struggle when the price of oil drops. The last few years, the price of oil per barrel has dropped significantly. That has a direct impact on the available income necessary to sustain your infrastructure. Russia went through that change. Okay. You can see 75% of its exports in the 2013 timeframe were attributed to oil and gas. When the price of a barrel of oil is $100, significantly more than when it's $30. When it went from $110 a barrel to 27, then back up, and now it's rebounding a bit today. Okay. How much money they had to invest in their military, in their roads and highways, in healthcare, significantly, it went through significant swings. Now, as I said, while they privatized some businesses in oil and gas in particular, specifically Gazprom, Rosneft, they really were privatized to those who were very well connected under the Soviet Union. So those revenues do find their way back to help out the government in some way. However, Russia's incurring more debt when that price per barrel of oil is real low. Here's the history. Just graphically, you don't need to necessarily read the details. You don't have to remember the details. Just understand that as it goes up and down, it has a direct impact on their economy. Now, I'm going to introduce something here. I think you're all familiar with gross domestic product, GDP. At least you've heard the term. You might have heard a couple of other terms similar to that, gross national product, GNP. We tend to use them interchangeably, but there is a difference. But we don't have to get into all the nuances of why it's different, but understand it's an aggregate collection, an aggregate total of the amount of product produced by companies, and then you roll it all up and you add it all together. It's their investment. It's a variety. It's about 4 different aspects of it's the revenue generated, it's the investments made, it's their current account. It's a variety of things that go into creating what the GDP is. Now, PPP is purchase power parity. This is an adjustment that is made to GDP to kind of level out and make a comparison from one country to another. It's not necessarily fair to compare the GDP of the United States with a multi-trillion-dollar economy to that of Kenya. Okay, GDP 5.8% growth in Kenya is significant. 2%, 3% in the United States is, on a pure dollar basis, more. Bigger economy. Okay. So we kind of adjust these to kind of give it some apples to apples comparison, if you would, and that's really what we use. It's called PPP, purchase power parity. It's an adjustment that's made to the GDP to kind of level set and give you an apples to apples comparison. So when we adjust it, various organizations look at this, OECD for one organization, the World Economic Forum and others, they compare country to country and give you a sense of how good they're doing in terms of their economy, because it's an important decision that we want to make when we're going to invest our foreign direct investment into a particular country. We also look at whether or not a country is, quote, free. Do people, citizens, have the ability to make decisions, or are they driven by someone in the government structure? An organization called Freedom House tracks freedom. They give it a rating, they give it a ranking. They look at this in terms of your civil liberties, laws that protect your freedom of speech and so on, freedom of press. They look at this and they compile it and they ultimately create a score and a ranking. By the way, Russia is considered not free in that context. This graph in your text really kind of gives you a sense, your color coding, just quickly looking at what parts of the world does this World Forum, Freedom of the Press Institute, consider free versus not free. Okay. Certainly North America, United States, Canada, more free. Australia, more free. Parts of Western Europe, more free. Okay. And to varying degrees, we see the yellow in the middle and then the red in the not as free. All right, decisions we have to make. Very briefly, we'll talk about Brazil, a great country. I've been there a couple times. It's a lot of challenges. It's one of the few countries that I've been to where I literally had to remind myself on a couple of occasions, I'm not here to solve their social problems. I'm here to do my job, do the business I'm here to conduct, and then let others deal with the other issues that are around us. Considered moderately free based on the charts and the freedom ranking I just mentioned. Built a part of its economy, a sizable part of its economy is on oil and gas. All right. There is a fair amount of corruption still to this day in Brazil, embedded in government officials who, as transitions occur at government, some benefit, some do not. A variety of bribery and improper use of funding really has caused some issues over time. It's a society of who you know, not necessarily what you know. Ranks pretty low in terms of corruption. Various governments and presidents have had their bribery scandals. You can read through the history on your own, quite frankly. Okay. Sadly, it exists. And that bribery comes from companies or individuals within a company. And as we're going to see in a little bit, there are laws that say that should not be done. And there are penalties when it is. If you're a construction company looking to grow in a country, you need permits. How do you obtain those permits? Legally or illegally? How do you gain a competitive advantage over someone else who may be bidding on that same contract? These are the ethical and legal dilemmas that we're often faced with. How do we win when sometimes the headwinds are pretty significant? There's a long history right through as recent of this last couple of years. Every administration through Brazil has some form of corruption scandal. Now, the last bullet on this slide is pretty significant. Because while the political elements of Brazil have had their legal dilemmas, the judicial system works. The charges were brought, justice was done, the legal system worked, the judicial system worked. So there is some elements here that, and I, having been to Brazil myself, I know it's a great opportunity if they can only get out of their own way at times. Okay. Now, Walmart. Sure, you all go to Walmart, right? And Walmart, has its own challenges and its own public relations challenges over time, both in this country and elsewhere. One of the things we'll talk about here shortly in the theory part of this discussion is what's called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, FCPA. Walmart looking to grow into Mexico. Same way I just mentioned a moment ago. When you want to build, how do you navigate the permit process? The bureaucracy needed to succeed and build your business, build your operation, establish a footing, a foundation in a country before all of your competitors. How do you do that? How do you navigate that? All right. Now, one of the challenges too is they kind of picked a location that was protected within a historical area, within a short distance from some historical sites. Pyramids, ancient pyramids. That said, they still wanted to locate in that particular area because they felt it was the best location for their business. They opened in 2004 with some significant opposition. They were found to have paid some bribes to Mexican officials in order to obtain that location. All right. So what's even worse than breaking the law? Hiding it. Now trying to hide it. Okay. All right, New York Times makes a publication. They find out Walmart did this. Some press comes up. They decided to fight. They decided to try and bury it by hiring about 300 lawyers to go fight the battle for them. Spent over $500 million in legal fees. Ultimately, they lost. They were fined some more, another $283 billion worth of legal and penalty costs, trying to sustain a location that they shouldn't have been in the beginning. It's bad enough to break the law. It's even worse to try and cover it up and then to expend all of those funds when they could have easily put it in a slightly different location and really not had all of this headache. Sometimes people are so close to an issue and so wrapped up into it, they forget to look clearly at it. Lastly, I'm going to talk very briefly using Starbucks as an example about intellectual property. Another element of when we conduct business on a global scale, oftentimes our businesses are based and have their foundation in various intellectual property that we have. Maybe we have technological patents, copyrights, trademarks. And when we want to operate in another part of the world, how do we protect ourselves from somebody stealing our intellectual property? Starbucks in China had that dilemma. Well, they ultimately won this case. I'm going to let you decide for yourself. A local competitor decided to create a logo. There's the logo. What do you think? Is it pretty close?
Yeah, it's pretty blatant.
Sorry, somebody say that?
Yeah, it's pretty bad. That's very
Yeah.
simple.
Yeah, so there you go. The local competitor in this particular case wants to capitalize on a major corporation, create their own logo. Not only that, but the actual words that are used when translated appropriately really come very close to two words, star and bucks. All right. So yes, Starbucks won the case. Cease and desist was given. Company paid a small fine. Starbucks back in business without too much problem. Small example, but one I personally have been part of, and I do understand it happens. Everything from a website. When we file a patent and we want to do business in various countries, we have to get registration in each of those countries. Very expensive process. Okay. Roughly $3,000 to $5,000 per registration. And if we want to operate in 100 countries, it adds up pretty quick. All right, last one, move on to some theory. Saudi Arabia. Their transformation, their strategic transformation, probably one of the most ambitious economic development programs, quite frankly, that in my existence that I've ever been aware of. Okay. Yes, there's been a lot of great companies who've really tried to become better. We talked about Kenya and how they did it and so on. Saudi Arabia, just like I've said earlier, built on what? Oil and gas, right? Oil prices are going up, doing really well. Oil prices come down, not doing so well. Okay? Probably doesn't hurt the royalty that much, but the rest of the population certainly does. All right, GDP, pretty significant. Okay? PPP adjusted GDP. And that first line there is $16. That's actually 16% of the world's oil reserve. But all right, you get the idea. They wanted to transition from purely oil and gas to something else, and they put a strategy in place called Vision 2030. Goal: reduce their dependence on oil. Privatize some of the state-owned business, in particular Saudi Aramco, major corporation valued at over $2 trillion, not a small company. They want to increase the private sectors. They want to reduce barriers to trade in the form of subsidies for both energy and water that exist. And we'll talk a lot about subsidies and other barriers to trade this semester. They included a value-added tax, okay, to try and pay for any deficit that they may have incurred. Significant statement in the culture of Saudi Arabia is to loosen the cultural codes, to improve the opportunities for women in particular. Driving, I mean, things that we find abhorrent. Okay? To think that a woman needs permission to drive a car. A woman needs permission to go to the movie theater or whatever. I mean, that's not something we fundamentally accept in our culture. Saudi Arabia is making some attempts to improve that. And I can assure you that's not easy, but the effort there is underway. Now, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia certainly has been in the news in the last couple of years, and not necessarily in the best public relations light either, but and quite frankly, in order to eliminate some of the resistance, he had some of his own family arrested so that he could implement the vision to 2030. This is the strategic statement, and it's pretty much what I said. Their vision, as I mentioned, to improve infrastructure in the area of energy and water, build infrastructure both in terms of roads and highways, effectively create an entire electronic smart city. A number of specific initiatives. You can read through this on your own. This is, I know it's an eye chart, but went out and issued an initial public offering, IPO, in order to help fund its program. Added an additional $4 billion to a significant program already. Now, the price of oil and gas, as it goes up and down, as it goes down, it really sets the foundation that they need to move to something else. But when the price comes back up, as it is today, you have to ask yourself, do they really want to get away from oil and gas? And there's a number of factions within Saudi Arabia, Saudi Aramco in particular, to kind of put resistance and say, no, let's remain oil and gas dependent. So we'll see where it leads. As I said, we're in the living classroom. So there's still, from the standpoint of the NEOM, N-E-O-M, that's the smart city I just referred to, there's still a $500 billion or $500 billion, $500 billion investment in that city taking place. So no matter what happens to oil and gas, they certainly are going to create a smart city. And I hope to get there someday. All right, those are some examples. Different countries and how they apply various elements of the political, economic, and legal components that we need to be aware of and cognizant of as we look to expand our business. Now, I'm going to skip past some of this political system elements, but I want you just to be exposed that there are different types of political systems. Collectivist versus individualistic, okay? In other words, capitalistic free market versus socialism, central planning. Those are the kind of extremes, if you would. All different types of economic systems in between that on a continuum. From some form of democracy to some form of totalitarianism in terms of the political makeup. In a collectivist society, socialistic based, we have the greater good as opposed to the individual benefits. Okay? We're stressing collective goals as opposed to something that benefits us as individuals. Individualism, the opposite. Okay? Individual freedoms ultimately benefit the whole. A little bit of a history lesson here. You can read it on your own that there was a split between some of the communistic and social democrats. Those who call themselves social democrats really evolved. And it's a bit more in terms of how you apply their common philosophy. You can read that on your own. I'm not going to test you. Okay, totalitarianism has different forms. We see it in pure communism. We see it in theocratic, religious-based totalitarianism countries. We see it in the form of tribal foundations. We see it in some groups that have emerged in different parts of the world, even in the United States, in terms of various right-wing or other left-wing related totalitarian philosophies. We put this in the context and contrast it to more of a free society in the democratic approach. And again, this is not political science class. Just simply exposing you to when we're going to embark on business in a particular country, it's imperative for us to understand the basic foundation of their political system. When we do this, we conduct an analysis. A lot of components go into that analysis, and today we just talk about basically three of them: political, economic, and legal. We touched on that in the case examples, the country examples in this opening session. There's others. We can certainly look at the social elements, technological, environmental aspects. That's analysis called PESTEL. And it's something we conduct when we look at what's called the current situation. And you'll see the project team structure as a bit of an assessment that I'm looking for you to create. This is the essence of that. This gives you a little sense of the distinctions between free market and command-based or centrally planned-based economies. You can read through these on your own, but basically, private ownership versus state ownership of businesses. Who makes the decision-making? At least the large policy-based ones, centrally or corporately. How is pricing set? Is it highly regulated, or are the free market forces that control pricing? These are the kind of the components that go into distinguishing and defining the differences between a free market and a centrally planned or command-based economy. Continuum. One extreme versus the other. Pure planned on one, pure free market on the other, and some variance in between. All right, now if we talk about legal systems, we have different types of rules of law, right? Now, how are they resolved? What type of law are we talking about? The different forms of common law, civil law. Civil law. It's a set of laws written, documented, precedent associated with that in terms of common law. A little bit fluid, based on more tradition-based and what happened before. Then there's theocratic law in terms of some of the theocratically totalitarian organizations, how law is driven there. See that more in Islamic-based countries. When we discuss contracts, it's a critical part of everything we're going to do when we conduct business around the world. Not one project, not one program that I ever worked on that did not have some form of contract associated with, some form of agreement. From a sales agreement to a long-term joint venture partnership to ownership and so on. How we share resources, how we manage intellectual property, all of the above. is put into a document and detailed out beyond anything that in some cases you can imagine. I've had a lawyer tell me that, look, you may be friends today, but the contract is designed not just because you're friends today, but what happens if you're not friends in the future? How do you mitigate disputes? How do you manage the issues that might come up? So you've got to think through, and don't think through with your brain, not your heart, in some cases. There's differences in the types of contracts, common law, civil law. Okay? Very detailed, or something that's just more short-based. Okay? It just defines a simple relationship without necessarily getting into all the contingencies and potential challenges. Well, what happens if we create a cross-country agreement? My company in the United States and a subsidiary or a potential partner in another country, Germany, Italy, China. The United Nations has some support for us. Their organization, Contracts for International Sale. They provide guidance. They provide a kind of legal foundation that we can build on and grow from there. It gives us some degree of uniformity in terms of the sets of rules that define business between these respective countries. And quite frankly, how we manage the sale of goods, the transactions that occur. The United Nations provides us some guidance in that regard. When we look at another country, ownership of property is pretty important for us to understand. Is it clean? Are there ambiguities in terms of who owns the property and who has the rights to decision-making on land and or capital goods? Property rights is critical for us to understand. And there'll be some examples in coming chapters here where in forming a relationship with some Russian companies at one point, it looked like it was working very well until they realized that there was a lot more to the who owned the property. And ultimately they came back to hurt them later on. How do you handle disputes? What happens when a dispute occurs or when a violation occurs? How do we manage that? This is critical for us to recognize that doing business in a country requires a good in-depth understanding of how to resolve problems that occur in ownership, in transfer, in decision-making of what can occur on that property or with that property. When damages occur, how do we provide compensation? Our legal systems should define this. Various organizations look at and rank corruption by country. Provide some essence, some guidance in terms of where we might and where we might not want to do business. Every ranking has a couple of countries at the top of the list in terms of the most corrupt. Somalia, Venezuela. What's our interest in foreign direct investment in Somalia or Venezuela right now? Pretty low. Not interested in getting caught up in wasting our money, our resources, our limited resources, investing in countries that have significant corruption rankings. If I'm putting my money someplace, I'm probably putting it in New Zealand and Sweden as opposed to Somalia and Venezuela. Looking at this list. All right, remember this. And I'm not saying just remember this one because of it's going to be on a quiz. Remember this when you graduate and you're doing business. Familiarize yourself, study the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. What can you do? What can you not do? Conducting business. This is the law that guides us in terms of our behavior and our conduct in an international world. Simply stated, we cannot bribe a foreign official. We cannot obtain business through bribery. Our company must keep definitive records of everything that occurs on a global basis. And those records document how good we are doing, or sadly, in some cases, if we cross the line.
Is the FCPA specific to the US, or is it?
This particular law is, but there are comparable laws in other countries. All right. Good question. So various international organizations, and we got to be very careful here. It may be legal in one country to pay an official, but it is not legal here. Important to understand that distinction. Don't get caught up. Well, it's okay there. Everybody else is doing it. Now, that said, there are international laws that say it is okay at times to provide some financial support to facilitate a payment if it's done properly, right? And it's a very fine line, so I will say if you're ever going to do something or even thinking about it, call your corporate lawyer. Get them involved up front and make sure that you are as transparent to the letter of the law. Follow their guidance. I just retired, from my career. Not only did I spend a lot of time throughout my entire career with the lawyers, but we also had lawyers in what's called the corporate compliance group. And they managed our ability, not just in terms of financial transactions, but transmitting electronic data about technology. All of these things are very important for you to familiarize yourself and understand as you do business. Please don't call me later on from prison. All right, and this chart gives you this one on the next slide gives you a little bit of sense of what happens, okay, when companies have been found to be in violation. All right, Department of Justice is going to take a slice. Securities and Exchange Commission is going to take a slice. You're going to get fined. You're going to pay lawyers, much like we talked about Walmart did. There's so many different costs that go into this. It's not just the fact that you may end up in prison, but there's fines and the damages associated with that. Siemens, Alstrom, Kellogg, Brown and Root, Halliburton, KBR, Halliburton fell into that trap that I mentioned earlier. What happens when you're trying to build a facility, a construction site in another country, and they need to facilitate payments. Okay. BAE Systems, sizable defense contractor. You know, the list goes on. As recent as a company in Sweden, Telia company, in, you know, $1 billion in terms of fine. Okay. All right, I've kind of touched base on this already a little bit in terms of intellectual property, but three basic components. Remember these components, if you would, for quizzing and otherwise. Copyrights, patents, trademarks. There's actually a fourth called trade secrets, which is the undocumented processes that we use to make something. Copyrights, you know, the written authorization of an author, okay? Composers, playwrights, artists, copyright something. I have a copyright to my name. Trademarks, I'm gonna register my brand, my image. Coca-Cola, Coca, Starbucks, okay? It's a registered trademark. Oh. Yeah. Please wait while the system shuts down. Okay. I don't know what to tell you at this point. If you can go on to Canvas, pull up the file I sent. Let's see, press here. Let's see. Oh, system's restarted. All right, I'll talk and well, the system restarts. Okay. Gotta love technology, right? So this chart really shows you the fourth element here. Patents, trademarks, copyrights, trade secrets. Trade secrets are the things I don't want to publicize or publish. Patents, when I file and receive a patent, I get protection for a number of years. That's a good thing. I also tell everybody what I have. Generally speaking, for at least for a period of time, that's a good thing unless somebody finds a way around that patent or to copy it or to infringe upon it. And then we run into other issues. And that happens, unfortunately, all too much. We have organizations that help manage the disputes about intellectual property across borders. World Intellectual Property Organization. Paris Convention for the protection of this intellectual property. These are some international foundations that we can turn to when something occurs, like Starbucks and the company infringing on their trademark. We have laws around product safety, liability. Those of us who make products that are used by the public need to conform to various standards. We need to make sure it's safe. General Motors in a vehicle has standards that they need to live to make sure that that product is safe. Generally speaking, they do a pretty good job in it. Maybe a few hiccups over the years with Toyota or any number of automobile vehicle out there, but generally speaking, pretty good. They follow pretty good standards. They're called ISO, International Standards Organizations. Generally speaking, the airlines does a pretty good job, albeit Boeing had some hiccups that caused people lives. Product safety laws and associated liability are important. Those of us like myself who have built and brought consumer electronics to marketplace, we have guidance as well. Okay? Certain voltage requirements, certain safety requirements. Does the product heat up? Any number of variables that we have to follow to make sure that we follow and conform to guidelines for product safety. Of course, it's intuitive to think that the food and drug industry certainly has significant standards to be met, okay? And oversight from the FDA and others to bring those products to market. So that kind of brings us to closure in terms of a quick overview of some of the political, legal, and economic considerations we need to be cognizant and aware of as we conduct business around the world. A quick overview. Now we're going to get into a lot of these topics in a bit more detail throughout this semester. We'll talk not just in a gloss sense, like I just mentioned about international standards, but in a few chapters, we're going to get into great detail of what kind of policies do companies follow to maintain high levels of quality? What standards do they follow? And we'll get into more details on that throughout the semester. But so with that said, unless there are any questions for me today, we're done, and I will see you on Thursday. Everybody. Thanks, everybody online.
Thanks, Professor. Have a good one.